All right, looks like we are all here. So let's just get started. Um, Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today on this discussion on a very important topic, our mental wellness. I will be your moderator today. And for those of you who don't know me, I am Padma Shri Warrior. I'm the founder and CEO of Fable. We are a mobile first company that brings stories for everyone. And before starting Fable, I was the CEO of Neo US and the Chief Development Officer for Neo Inc., a China based manufacturer of electric cars and autonomous vehicles. And prior to Neo, I was the Chief Technology and Strategy Officer for Cisco. I currently serve on the boards of Microsoft and Spotify. So this panel discussion will last about an hour. We'll spend about 40 minutes or so where I'll ask the panelists different questions on mental wellness, mental fitness. And after that, in the last 15 to 20 minutes, we'll take questions from all of you. So please post your questions in the chat during our discussion, and I will be monitoring the chat and pick the questions. And hopefully we'll get to all of your questions. We'll have enough time to do that. With that, it's now my pleasure to introduce the experts on this panel today. First, Dr. Megan Bell. Megan, please wave so that everyone can see you. Megan Bell is Chief Strategy and Science Officer at Headspace. Megan leads the company's strategy, corporate and technology strategy. Prior to Headspace, Megan was Chief Science Officer and founder at Lantern, an evidence-based digital mental health company. Megan is also an adjunct clinical assistant professor at Stanford University. Her academic and advocacy work has been recognized by the National Institute of Mental Health, the US House of Representatives, the European Union, and Stanford University, among others. Megan is a Nike Performance Council member and is on Google and YouTube's mental health advisory panel. Welcome, Megan. Next, we have Professor Josie Billington. Josie, if you can also wave, thank you. Josie is a professor at University of Liverpool and serves as the Deputy Director of the Center for Research into Reading, Literature, and Society. This is an organization that explores the role literature and reading plays on mental and physical health. Dr. Billington has published extensively on the positive impact literary reading has on our well-being and mental health. She's currently engaged in research projects that examine reading's relationship to chronic pain. And to be honest, her research was one of the inspirations behind the founding of Fable. We're so glad to have you join us. Josie is joining us actually from the UK. So it's evening for her. We also have Dr. Steven Schuler. Steven, please wave. Dr. Steven Schuler is an associate professor of psychological science and informatics at the University of California in Irvine. As a clinical psychologist and mental health service researcher, his work broadly looks at making mental health resources more available and accessible, especially through the use of technology. He has received Rising Star Awards from the Association for Psychological Science and the International Society for Research on Internet Interventions. And thank you all for joining me today. So first I'll start with Josie, and all of the panelists, please remember to unmute yourselves. So Josie, tell us a little bit more about how you found yourself studying mental health.
Hello, good evening from me. Yes, I'm an English literature specialist by trade, so it's an odd thing perhaps for me to be part of the mental health world. But I've always thought of literature as something that deserves to exist beyond university walls. And for that reason, I'd collaborated for a long time with a UK national charity called The Reader. And their mission really was to take great books out to people who need them, wherever they are, whoever they are. And that was really their mission, but they were finding that people who were reading in their reading groups were reporting benefits in terms of reduced anxiety, alleviation of symptoms of depression, and they were coming to rely on their weekly contact with literature. So, and at the same time, I was working with psychologists and medics at the University of Liverpool who were concerned about the paucity, really, of treatments for people suffering, and there were kind of burgeoning numbers of people suffering from mental health difficulties. The only treatments really were drugs and short-term therapy. So really those interests came together because of, they coincided because of two areas of my work. So
awesome. Thank you. We're glad you're doing that research, because I think there's just so many insights into that, which actually, frankly, I didn't know that reading is beneficial for mental health till I came across your work and other research that I read. So Megan, maybe a little bit from you, talk a little bit about your areas of expertise, and perhaps you can address the difference in definitions between mental illness and mental wellness, because sometimes people confuse the two. And even I, right? Like in the beginning, sometimes we think, why should I take care of my mental wellness? Because I'm okay, I'm not mentally ill. Can you talk a little bit about the definitional differences between the two?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me on the webinar today. My background, I'm a clinical psychologist. By training, I used to practice clinical psychology with patients and teach graduate students. But my whole career has been spent designing largely digital mental health interventions. And about 10 years ago, I moved into technology, really with the goal of making evidence-based interventions accessible outside of the context of research studies. And so I've really focused on how we create products that are clinically effective, but that people actually want to use and have a sustainable business model behind them. A lot of my work is actually focused on prevention from an academic context, as well as my work at Headspace. And when we talk about mental health, I think culturally, we often associate mental health with mental health disorders, and forget that we all have mental health, just like we all have physical health.
Yeah, that's a great point.
You know, when we think about the continuum of mental health, it really is important to understand that mental wellness or mental health promotion really is relevant across the board. When we talk about mental wellness, we're talking about things that reduce stigma, enhance overall psychological well-being, foster resilience, really create healthy lifestyle routines that foster positive mental health or mental healthfulness. And there's a continuum that then does stretch into what are subclinical symptoms of mental health disorders, common mental health disorders like depression and anxiety, and then serious mental illness, like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. And so there are different levels, but there are, prevention, health promotion are really relevant across the board.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I think we often forget that our mental wellness is so intricately connected with how we project that in terms of our physical health, right? It's sort of like we're all human beings. At some point, we all have stress about something or the other. So I think it's great to hear you talk about the definitional differences and why it's important that we should make this a priority, frankly. So Steven, I'll go to you next. Can you tell us a little bit about your background? You and I were talking earlier, and you told me you started off as a happiness researcher. I found that fascinating. And, is it possible to build scalable mental wellness solutions with technology? So sometimes people think technology is the cause of everything evil today for us in terms of anxiety in society. Love to hear your perspective, first on happiness, and second on what role can technology play in our mental wellness?
Yeah, thanks for the question and thanks for being part of this panel. And I think a lot of the experiences I have really resonate with some of the things that Megan just talked about. So similar to her background, I'm trained as a clinical psychologist. And I started my research and my work in an area that's known as positive psychology, which really looks at sort of, the study of well-being, the study of flourishing. And, as I would often have to tell the people to make them understand what I do, or as I would tell to my mom, I was a happiness researcher. And I think that sort of the insights from positive psychology and the insights that we learn from this field is that there's a lot of things that we can do to think about our mental wellness and our well-being, and there's scientifically backed things. And that, I think self-care does not mean taking a warm bath. Self-care means, investing in relationships, investing in yourself, eating well and moving well, finding times in your day to find some spaces of focus, and that can come in a lot of different ways. Meditation and products like, Megan works on at Headspace, or reading to sort of engage in people's curiosity and opportunities to dive in. And what we find from the science of happiness is that there are particular strategies that happy people and people who sort of live mentally well lives tend to do. They tend to invest in other people. They tend to invest in themselves. They tend to practice these self-care strategies. And I think that what we learn is that by teaching people and getting people to do those things, we can have people live the lives that they want and live sort of mentally healthier lives. I really sort of shifted about a decade ago, kind of moving into a direction of thinking about technology, because I was really interested in trying to get more things to the people who need it. I was never going to have an impact sitting in my clinical office, to the degree of being able to reach the people who really need care. And so I think technology offers a lot of potential to sort of reach people and to scale these scientifically backed solutions, and ways to provide people these strategies that we know can work, but it needs the technologies need to focus on those parts of the science. And so technology is not a panacea. It's not going to solve our problems just because it can reach a lot of people. We need to think about how we reach people with the right types of things to help them promote mentally healthier lives.
That's a great note to self. Self-care doesn't equal warm baths. That's a great line. Thank you. And Josie, back to you. You've done a lot of research on the role reading plays on mental and actually even physical health. Tell us a little bit about that and share a few key takeaways. Because, when, even for me, it was sort of non-intuitive when I first came across the research. And so I think a lot of people don't know the connection between reading and mental health.
I think it's non-intuitive actually for a lot of readers as well. I think people, one of the reasons it works is that people aren't really expecting it to. So literature can speak very, very powerfully to people who are experiencing difficulty. It's not uncommon for people to say things like, "This is me," or there are powerful moments of recognition. And I think that has two consequences really. It can be it can make people feel very much less lonely when they realize that they're not the only people experiencing this. So people can say, "This is me," but also, "I didn't know that other people felt this way." But unlike other kinds of therapy, if I can call it that, it's never actually demanding. A piece of literature will never demand that people are actually identifying closely with something. It's not raw and confessional, because you're thinking about those serious life issues that have affected you in some way in relation to somebody else, the character or the speaker in the poem. So I think it's a kind of safe distance to address often quite serious and sometimes existential issues. And I think it's the kind of mixture of two things. It's very personal, it's very direct, and it's also at a kind of low risk distance.
Yeah.
That's part of it.
Yeah, it's a great thing. I know reading and books and stories, I think what you said is so true. They don't demand anything of you, right? There's no expectation. You don't have to look good. You don't have to sound smart. You just immerse yourself and connect with the characters. And that in itself is very freeing in some ways, to be sort of like find a space where you can truly be yourself and enjoy what's happening in the book. So that's great insight. Thank you for that. So Megan, why should we worry about mental wellness if we are otherwise healthy? In other words, we have so much on our plates already. Why should we make reading and meditation, these kinds of things, a priority in our lives?
Well, I think when we create these healthy routines, whether it is reading, meditation, spending time making phone calls to friends, going for walks as a family around the neighborhood, these routines really allow us to enhance our well-being right now, but ideally really build a sense of or quality of resilience so that when something happens, because it always does, we weather that storm more effectively. Often when stress builds up or something happens in our life, our ability to cope is really predicated on how much you have already invested in your overall kind of ability to withstand that stressor, which is, research indicates is really influenced by, your mental ability to experience emotions, but not let them become sticky and stay with you for a long period of time, to not be kind of pushed off of those routines by new stressors. And so really training your ability to maintain healthy routines lets you ideally prevent the onset of a mental health disorder. The best case is that you are, one, feeling happier, you're more grounded, you're probably feeling more connected with other people, you're likely more compassionate and patient towards other people in your life. So there are a lot of benefits for you individually, but also to those around you by practicing these, well-being routines. But ideally, you also are preventing suffering, or you're reducing that suffering.
Yeah, great. That's such a great point. I mean, I think the trouble is, and maybe this is a question to all of you. With physical health, there are markers, right? Like we all go for a physical, hopefully annually, and we find certain things, our blood pressure, blood tests. These are all fever if you're not well. We do get some indications. With mental wellness, are there markers that we should look for? And again, before you all answer that question, I'd like to remind our participants, please ask your questions through the chat. Click on the chat button, post your questions as we are speaking, and at the end of the session, I will direct those questions to our speaker. So yeah, are there markers that we should look for with our mental wellness?
I can start. I mean, I think there certainly are. One of the reasons that my work is actually, I've shifted to focusing on mindfulness and meditation is because I think awareness of your own emotional state, of your thoughts, is really the key to empowering you to actually be aware of how you're doing. That lets you really be able to self-correct in real time if you need to, or ask for help. It's really being aware of, this is what it looks like and feels like when I'm, mentally well. And this is what it looks like and feels like when I'm starting to move towards anxiety or sadness that is potential for becoming depression. I think that it can feel like these are invisible warning signs, but they are very real. They're in our body, they're in our emotions, they're in our thoughts. And I'll let others respond because I'm sure there's additional thoughts on this subject.
Yeah, I think that we do have a lot of markers that we can pay attention to. I think sleep is one. We all differ in terms of how much sleep we need, but people can definitely feel like when their sleep is disrupted and when they don't wake up feeling refreshed and rested. I think that's an indicator that something is concerning. I think sort of similarly, sense of optimism and hope about the future. So if there are not things that you look forward to or you're excited about, and I think that that's especially challenging right now. But I also know people's mental health is really taxed right now. But I think a feeling that there can be better days ahead and that we have things that we can do to better our lives and better the world, I think is something that's a big indicator of sort of living being in a place where one's having a mentally healthy life. And I think having a sense of I liked what Megan said about attention. I usually think about this as focus, but feeling like one is finding focus and that they're able to be in the moment and be attentive for things. Finding that sense of focus, I think, is another good indicator of being in sort of a mentally healthy spot.
Dr. Billington, anything to add from you?
Yeah, just to add to that, that I encounter a lot of people who say that they can't read when they feel depressed or anxious. And I would say that one symptom of wellness, if you like, is the ability to carry on reading. And one of the great achievements, I think, of people returning to reading is that they can concentrate again. And concentration there really means exactly what you're talking about, living in the moment. Although it's a story, of course, it's an experience, and being able to focus on that experience is, I think it's one of the kind of, perhaps when people can actually do it, one of the shortcuts back into a sort of meditative frame of mind. So
that's great. These are points we will take into account and should watch out for, right? Like when we're not able to focus, when we feel like we can't even get through a few pages a day or sit still for 5 minutes and in general feel like we're unfocused. These are all indications that it's time to slow down, perhaps. Steven, so you talk a lot about a holistic approach to mental well-being. Tell me a little bit more about what you mean by a holistic approach, and related to that, these days especially, but in general, I feel like we're all juggling so many things all at once, right? Like our work and our families, and now all of you are emphasizing staying in connection with our friends. That takes time investment. We have so many things we're trying to juggle. How do we make mental wellness a priority?
Yeah, I think I'll say a lot of the way I feel this bounces off some of the things Megan said earlier about sort of mental health. And I think that people often hear a statistic that 1 in 4 individuals will experience a mental health issue. And I often say 100% of people have mental health. We all experience mental health. We all get stressed. We all feel anxious. We all feel sad. For not everybody that reaches clinical levels, but that doesn't mean we don't face sort of mental health stressors and challenges. And so I think like reframing the thinking about this is not 1 in 4, this is 100%, this is everybody, and makes it an important way to sort of have conversations and facilitate. So I think that's one way I sort of think about sort of holistic. I think another way is, as a clinical psychologist, I often tell people if people ate well, slept well, moved well, and had meaningful relationships, I wouldn't have a job, and people don't, and so I do. And so I think that a lot of what we often try to do is help people engage in multiple different parts of their lives. I think talk with a lot of clients I work with about this as sort of like a chair or a stool. There's these different legs, and you might be able to kick one of them out and get by okay for a little bit of time. But once you lose 2 legs, 3 legs, all legs, life gets really hard. And so I think that when we think about sort of mental wellness and mental health holistically thinking, it's how these different aspects of our lives kind of contribute to our ability to stand firm in the face of stressors. And again, bouncing off some of the stuff Megan said earlier, I think the ability to sort of bounce back, be resilient in the face of stressors is an amazing hallmark of mental health and mental wellness. And so we need to think about those different factors that allow us to hold that resilience and hold that ability to bounce back.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So now, Josie, you said, I was reading about what you've written before, and I came across this. You said literature has therapeutic effects but not if you introduce it as a therapeutic intervention. You begin with a book, not with a health agenda, and that seems to work better. Uh, Tell me more about that. I was so intrigued when I read that. And in connection to that, is there a particular kind of book that is more beneficial when it comes to mental health and mental fitness, or is it just broadly reading?
So just to go back to the first point, first of all, why just a book and not a health agenda? I think it's sort of related to what Stephen was saying, that good literature will always take seriously, very, very seriously, human trouble, but it will also kind of reassure that it's common to all. It says that everybody is unhappy at some point, and it's not necessarily a kind of illness or a disease of some kind, and that's a massively reassuring to people. But I think it's also that it goes back to that kind of surprise element I was talking about earlier on, that people don't look to a book as they might go to a doctor or a counsellor or a psychologist, and they're not going looking for a cure. So very often reading can kind of catch people unaware and kind of reach to those kind of involuntary places that people might want to avoid even in therapy. It can actually emotionally touch those and get beneath defences. People are very often surprised by that. So I think it's the kind of happening that, as I say, systematic therapy or starting with a therapeutic agenda might miss out. And in terms of what actually helps to produce that deep resonance, it depends on the person. It really does. I mean, for some people it's fiction, for some people it's poetry. Broadly speaking, I'd say that fiction produces a kind of engaged relaxation. I hesitate to use the word relaxation because it's not passivity, but it's as though you're kind of absorbed within another life. And it kind of touches off resonances with your own life. But you are kind of in a sort of alternative sequence, an alternative world. I think what happens in poetry very often, because of its difficulty, because of its formal shape, because of its compressed metaphor and use of language and formality, it can actually be a kind of awakening for people. It can be much more direct, much more of a kind of direct hit. But I'm speaking in very general terms there. On the whole, we found that fiction works really well for people with depression. Poetry works really, really well for people struggling with dementia, because they can concentrate on and focus in on really short, sharp areas, and it's a great stimulus to memory as well.
That's great. I read a lot of fiction and poetry, so both of them, and I'm so pleased that we now have a poet who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, Louis Gluck, one of my favorite poets. So I'm so thrilled about that. That's great insights. I think it's something that a lot of people don't know about, right? Like, what should we read, and why should reading help us? So, Megan, how does my meditation help with mental wellness? Is meditation the same as mindfulness? Is there a difference between the two? I meditate every day. I meditate for about 20 minutes before I go to bed. I've been doing it for 25 years now. I taught myself how to do it because I'm a very hyperactive person. In the beginning, I couldn't sit still even for like 2 minutes. Now I do it for 20 minutes. But in my case, it was triggered by grief, and I lost my mother the same year that I had a newborn. My son was born. There was just a lot going on, and I had a career. And so I literally was feeling really overwhelmed and felt like I just needed to sit calmly and breathe. And that's sort of how I got into meditation. But yeah, sometimes even I'm confused. Is mindfulness the same as meditation? And how exactly does meditation help? Just like we know reading helps. So yeah, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So I think many people, especially now that mindfulness and meditation have become part of popular culture, are a little confused about the difference between those terms. Meditation is really the formal practice of actually, cultivating the ability to be present. So it is, there are different types, many different types of meditation. Within even mindfulness meditation, which is the type of meditation that Headspace teaches, there are potentially thousands of different techniques. We have a subset of them designed to help most people learn, but it could look like focusing on your breath, really learning how to train your attention to be, come back to the present moment or come back to an intentional anchor. And so meditation really you can think of as that formal training or practice in present moment awareness and compassion, both for yourself and others. There's key aspects of meditation that pertain to attention training as well as acceptance. And mindfulness is really the quality of being present as we generalize that to the rest of our lives. And so mindfulness, ideally is a quality that you take with you outside of that meditation practice and bring to, the way that you show up and behave and experience your life. There's a lot of research on both. Most of the research is focused on the effects of guided meditation training specifically. And what we see is there are short-term benefits associated with meditation, really that pertain to, reductions in stress, reductions in, subclinical levels of anxiety and depression. There are enhancements for your ability to focus, really because you are training yourself and your ability to pay attention. And then there are physiological effects associated with meditation, lowering of blood pressure, lowering of kind of inflammatory responses, as well as over time with sufficient dose and duration of practice of meditation, there are changes in our brains. We know that the brain essentially becomes less reactive to stress or negative emotions. That's really changes that happen in an area of your brain called the amygdala. There are also changes in your prefrontal cortex, which is your attention center, your decision-making center, which enhance activation there. So it's essentially helping you turn down your reactivity, which we also talk about as this quality of equanimity, meaning a sense of kind of calm and being grounded, and as well as being able to focus on the present moment. And so that has ripple effects across our mental health, our physical health, as well as how we interact with those around us. We've found at Headspace that meditation can make people less irritable, can make people less aggressive towards provocation or towards other people, as well as behave more compassionately towards others. And so I really like to think about this as being something that it helps you sleep better, it helps you focus, it helps you feel better, but it also has this great ripple effect on those around you.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Stephen, I'll ask you the next question and then we'll go to questions from the audience. I'm seeing some great questions, so please keep those coming. If you're in the audience, Stephen, so this next question could be controversial. Often people blame technology and screen time for our mental wellness issues. So the question is all screen time bad? Or is it more how we apply that screen time? Yeah, so talk a little bit about that. Should we just put all our screens away? Is that the best thing to do?
I love controversial questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this a little bit. I know this is a concern of a lot of people, especially parents now, given the amount of time that kids are spending on their screens. And so I'll say that, overall, there's been a lot of science that's looked at this question, and the science has found that if there is an impact, it tends to be relatively small, but also somewhat inconsistent. And I think that there's not as much division nowadays between our offline and our online worlds. And even the concept of screen time is very different. It's not like, years ago when you might sit down in front of a TV show and watch, hours of TV. In the new sort of world of media, we're reading, we're creating, we're, doing lots of different things. And so I think what we find is that to the degree that when folks are using screens or technology, social media, and that they are connecting, creating, and contributing, that can actually be a very beneficial mental health benefit. There's a study that a colleague of mine ran that of teens that found that actually the days where teens spent most time on social media connecting to their friends were the days where they had the most positive emotions and the most well-being. But they were doing things where they were connecting meaningfully with other people. So I think it depends a lot on how folks use screens. There's definitely ways in which technology can bring out the worst in folks. Everyone looks good in the highlights. And so if we're constantly sort of comparing ourselves to these positive images we see of other people, that's not good and doesn't feel good. But there's also ways in which people can use technology in really powerful ways to be able to promote their mental health. We do a lot of work where we talk with people around the ways they use technology to benefit their mental health. And we've heard in studies, people making Spotify playlists that are sort of mood boosting and put them in a zone where they're able to perform well. People curating their Instagrams that it's positive images and things that they're able to turn to in times where they're not feeling well, to sort of get them back in a mode where they're able to get over the stressors and anxieties they're feeling with. And so, it's complicated. It's there's nuances here, but I'll say that overall the research doesn't support that technology is causing all these problems, and that there's lots of potential ways in which technology might be able to help.
Great. That's music to our ears at Fable, which is what we are trying to do. Is for those of you that don't know, our mission at Fable is to get people to read more and read great stories more. And we are thinking about combining technology to help people make reading a daily healthy habit. So let me now go to some questions from the audience. So we have lots of questions. I'll try to get to many of them here. So the first question is, what is the most viable way to treat mental illness? Is it looking for diagnostic pills, or is it talking things through? I guess this is more of a therapy question. So let's talk about that, and then I have other questions as well. Anyone want to tackle that? I think we somewhat addressed that, with saying there are preventive things we could do.
Yeah, I'll just say there's no one size fits all solution. There's nothing that's going to work well for everybody. Medication can be very beneficial for some. Psychotherapy can be very useful for some. Other types of supportive treatments, technologies, time in nature, there's lots of things that are shown to have sort of mental health benefits. And so I think that there's no one pathway that's going to get everyone on the road to recovery. And there's not one resource that's going to appeal to everybody to get them on the pathway to recovery. And so I think that we need a lot of solutions, and we need a portfolio of options so that we can offer people multiple things and not just, present one option to people. And I also think, as a theme in terms of the things we talked about and what you just mentioned, Padma, is, preventive care is so important here. We think a lot about this in physical health. We brush our teeth, we go to regular checkups, we do all these things for our physical health. And I think we need to really think about mental health in the same sort of way.
Okay, so I can go to the next question. So the next question, and any of you feel free to jump in. I think all of you could answer this. How much of an individual's mental health is related to workplace stressors? And do tools which help showcase an individual's work habits and work culture help in the process of managing their mental wellness? And what should organizations look at expressly doing with regards to this? So I guess it's 3 questions. So they're related. So anyone wants to tackle that?
Sure, I can start, and I'm sure Steven and Josie can build on it. So there's plenty of research that shows that for many individuals, their mental health is either positively or negatively impacted by their work environment. There are structural causes or contributors towards that. We know that for healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, et cetera, that structural conditions around the practice of their professions are really serious contributors to burnout as well as mental health disorders. And so I think, in many cases, it may be a structural issue. It may be related to kind of a critical or unsupportive culture or manager. But it's this both and answer about how we address that, because, while, those structural conditions or cultural conditions do need to change, at the same time, people have to cope with those conditions, given that, as we well know, structural issues are, take a little bit longer to shift. And so I think that this is a place where organizations should be looking at all of it. They should be looking at, and measuring with surveys, what culture, the subcomponents of their cultures. They should be implementing and evaluating the effectiveness of different strategies to improve culture overall, as well as within smaller teams. They should be understanding the structural contributors, such as not allowing people to take sufficient breaks or not having adequate time off, having too many back-to-back shifts, not having support for childcare or other caregiving responsibilities. There are a lot of financial and structural things that you can do as an organization that really have a dramatic impact on an employee's ability to take care of their mental well-being, as well as providing access to, tools and resources that, further enhance well-being, whether that are wellness resources or mental health resources.
Great.
Could I just say, actually, sorry, I was just going to say that I've been working with a mental health trust for many years, and one of the things that they've done is, from the top of the organisation to the bottom of the organisation, is have reading groups, weekly reading groups for staff, so that and it's a way of having protected time, both for professional care staff and patients, but also for the staff themselves, and to have a different form of interaction. So I just thought I'd mention that.
That's a great point. And thank you for bringing that up. I think we often forget the care workers in these environments and the stress they have to deal with, right? You're listening to everybody else's stress, and that's got to be bringing on your own stress. So thank you for bringing that up, Josie. So actually the next couple of questions are probably for you, Josie. I'll ask them both, and you can choose to answer them. So first question is, do you think particular kinds of reading, literary forms, genres, fiction, nonfiction, are more or less beneficial to mental health? And somewhat related to that is another question. Do you have any tips on how people can find the books and narratives that will speak to them most and mirror the issues that they struggle with, especially with fiction?
I'll take it's sort of easier to answer to the second one, because there are quite a number of books on the market now, which are there's one called The Novel Cure, an A to Z of cures, and there's the Poetry Pharmacy. There are quite a lot of books on the market now. Some of them are published by the charity I work with, the Reader as well, that are actually giving you tasters of, particularly of novels, but of poetry as well. So it might be worth actually having a look at those, just dipping into those and seeing which of the genre appeal to you. But there are also lots of, I don't really partake of these very much, but there are lots of kind of online fora where people are also talking about the books that they're enjoying. And I imagine that's something that this organisation will want to be part of as well. So I think a lot of people are in the same position. They don't know where to start. Where do I start to read, especially if the habit has lapsed? So recommendations from the wider world are really useful there. In terms of I'm a kind of literature expert. I would say always go to the classics, always start with the classics, because what you can be sure of there is a kind of seriousness and a truth, for want of a better word, in relation to human experience. But the other reason I would say that is that these are the kind of enduring works of fiction and poetry have endured because another human being in another time, often experiencing some form of difficulty, has worked really, really hard to find a language for what they're experiencing. And that's the kind of language I think that people are very grateful for when they're in trouble and they have some kind of despair that they can't easily name. And sometimes the therapeutic language is a little bit overused for that, and I think that's what really does speak to people, that they somebody has expressed something in a very considered and careful way, and so that's why I would say go to the classic literature, but then I wouldn't I?
Great. And for the audience, this is exactly what Fable is trying to solve, is curate great books. And we should have Professor Billington as one of our curators at some point and have her pick her book recommendations as well as the other speakers. So thank you for that, Josie. Let me move on. Here's a question, I think, Steven, maybe for you. This is, so almost everyone is feeling captive these days, being at home. This person saying, I feel the most impacted are our children, who are pretty much stuck in front of their computers most of the time, unable to have any social interactions with their friends and schoolmates. Does this have any negative effect on their mental health? And what advice do you have for parents? I guess this is broadly for everyone, who are sort of homeschooling children, and we're all kind of stuck at home for most of our time, and have been for the last, at least in the US, for the last 9 months now. So Steven, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it's challenging, and I really just want to sort of reflect and normalize the challenges and stress that people are feeling right now. It's a really difficult time, and I think that we don't fully know what the full impact of this is going to be. And I think but I think the indications that we're seeing is that people feel stressed and people feel anxious. I think the advice I would give to people, and especially the parents, is as much as possible to find places to have conversations and spaces for connection. And those conversations and connection might vary in terms of the age of the kid that you have, and the different things that they're dealing with. There's also lots of places to still try to find meaningful social connection, and that might be different at different ages. Fortunately, technology offers us a lot of opportunities to connect with people, but also to remember that technology is not always sort of age appropriate. And so we have to think about ways to adapt technologies to be useful for kids. I'll say I have kids, and they love to talk to their grandparents over FaceTime, and they both deal with different problems because they both don't quite understand this medium in different ways. But giving the kids opportunities to like sit and play a game or draw or do things like that is really useful, and can mirror some of the things that they would do if they were being able to interact. And so I think that we have to find ways to make the technology work for us in ways to promote those sort of meaningful social relationships.
Great. So there's a couple of questions related to this topic, and I guess any of you feel free to answer this. The question is, it can be difficult when a friend or a loved one is having problems with mental wellness. What approaches do you suggest to help someone who's struggling? And kind of related to that is another question. If you're a life partner to somebody who experiences more stress and anxiety than you do, what is the best way to help?
I can get us started on the answer. So I think first, there's a metaphor of put your oxygen mask on first, especially if this is a long-term partner who has more, chronic struggles with managing stress or their mental health. It's really important for you to be developing and practicing these healthy routines that support you, because it will enhance your capacity to be supportive and helpful towards other people. I think often, and this is actually where mindfulness can really help, is it can really enhance your ability to sit with other people's suffering in a way that lets you be there, link arms with them emotionally, but not feel like you need to take it on as something that you have to solve. I think often people want to be heard. They want to not be alone in their suffering. And that said, some people really do need help navigating to effective resources. One of the things that happens when you're really struggling with a mental health disorder like depression is it can be really hard for you to navigate the care system around mental health. And so that's a really important role that other people have to play, is, let me find a list of therapists. I'll call your insurance company with you, and we can, problem solve this journey towards effective care together. Often, it is bewildering to navigate our mental health care system in the United States, certainly, as well as in other countries. And so having a partner to problem solve when, maybe because of what you're struggling with, your brain really isn't processing information and problem solving in the same way it would be in a state of wellness.
Great. Anything else to add, Josie or Stephen?
I'll just say, I think that there's also this training known as mental health first aid, which can be really useful to help people understand some of the signs and symptoms, and to give people some skills that feels like it provides them some strategies to help other people. But I think what's worthwhile to note about mental health first aid is it's not to teach you to be a professional. It's not to teach you how to solve the problem. It's to teach you how to sort of listen and recognize, and to sort of do some of the things like Megan noted to help other people, find support. And so I think if you are looking for sort of resources yourself, Googling mental health first aid and seeing if there's a training of that you can get. I think it's a great training and a really great resource.
Great. Next question, I'm sure it's for Josie, but feel free if others want to jump in. Josie, the question is there greater benefit derived from reading compared to listening to books or listening to podcasts?
I'm so glad somebody asked this question. So quite a lot of my work has been, as I keep mentioning this charity, but I've done a lot of work with them, and they've set up reading groups around the UK. And what's really unique about these reading groups is that they are shared reading aloud groups. So people come together and experience a book in real time. And the reason for that is that for some of the reasons we were talking about before, that people that often, if they're feeling poorly, don't read very well. It's a wonderfully inclusive model, because you can have all kinds of difficulties, even with literacy or some kind of impairment that would stop you from reading the text, but you can still participate meaningfully because you're hearing the text read aloud. And one of the reasons I think there is often such a direct hit in to kind of personal issues in these reading groups is that when the book or poem is read aloud, and sometimes they can be quite challenging because some of the literature is very old, it's Shakespeare. When they're read aloud, they're not just words on a page or bits of print on a page. It's a kind of human, vocal, emotional voice that's being heard. It's being transmitted, and it's live and it's performative. And so I think probably I would say the audio experience, if you can combine the audio experience with seeing the print on the page, that's probably the best thing. So it might be something to think about for this company, actually, that having the two together can be quite extraordinarily good, so long as it's read well.
That's perfect. Perfect. Great. Anyone else want to add anything else? Before we go to so the next question is actually for me, so you guys can catch your breath. So the question is for Padma. As a legend in the tech sector, what inspired the transition to mental health and wellness? And what advice would you have for someone to make a career transition to a different sector? It's a great question. I'm an engineer by training. I've been in the tech industry for over 3 decades. What inspired me to start Fable, to focus around reading and mental wellness, is as I was thinking about doing something with AI and technology in the broadly wellness space, I came upon a lot of research that talked about how anxiety, depression, stress, workplace burnout, workplace induced stress is all going the wrong way, and at a dramatic rate. And you can argue it's because maybe we are more open about anxiety and stress these days than we were a decade ago, or it's genuinely going up because we're working longer hours these days. Whatever the reason is, it's definitely trending the wrong way, and it's primarily affecting younger people. And so this sort of was a wake-up call for me, and I felt like this is something I want to dedicate the next chapter in my career and my life to. And I'm an avid reader, and as I was sort of like reading this issue of stress and anxiety, I came across one of Josie's books. It's called Reading and Mental Health. It's a collection of scientific and medical research papers around the benefits of reading. And I started to read that book, and I'm an avid reader. And then I spent the next 6-7 months doing research on why don't people read more, and how could we help people A, make mental wellness a priority, and B, do things like meditation, reading, connecting with other people, listening to music, all these things that make us human. How do we use technology to sort of like bring humanity back to each of us? I guess that was my motivation, and I am proud to have a great team that's now working with me to build Fable. We hope to launch very soon and bring reading to everyone and bring stories to everyone. And so that was my motivation. So we only have 3 more minutes. So I think I'm not sure if we got to all of the questions, but thanks everyone for submitting the questions. So perhaps we can end with this question. Little bit about what do each of you do to manage your stress? And following up to this, if you don't mind sharing what, if anything, you're reading or listening to right now. Whoever wants to go first.
I'm happy to start. In the context of the pandemic and having a lot more time at home than I've ever had before, we've started some new family routines. So one of the highest points of my day is now going for a family walk around our neighborhood, where we go, from a distance, say hi to different neighbors. I sprint after my son on a scooter. So it's a combined kind of social tour and, time together, as well as getting some exercise. So that's what I'm doing. I'm rereading Factfulness by Han Johnson, which is a favorite.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites. Thank you, Megan. Josie, you want to go next?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm finding one of the ways to unwind from all of this screen time, I just find it very exhausting, is to do something that's close, Megan, to what you're describing, but I'm afraid it's just old-fashioned yoga, really. I'm not really doing much else than that. We are having family walks, but my children are getting rather too old for walking or reading. So, but the reading that I'm doing at the moment is actually Jane Smiley's The Last 100 Years. It's a kind of epic trilogy where she looks at the past century in America, and she takes a chapter for each year, and it's a wonderfully slow read. And what I love about it is it's very epic, but it's also very kind of domestic and intimate and tender in its details. And so you're drawn into this world, but you're also learning so much about what's got us where we are, because it's historical as well. Can recommend it.
Great recommendation. I need to add that to my list. Thank you. Steven.
I'm an avid runner, and I find my running time to be sort of my own time and my meditative time. I had a summer where I actually got a series of like ear infections, and so I wasn't allowed to wear headphones while I ran, and never picked up the sort of habit of doing so, despite being a marathoner. And the practice of going out for 20-mile runs by yourself teaches you a lot about yourself, and also I think helped me find ways to use that time as a way that really was very restorative to me. In terms of reading, I have 3 5-year-olds, and so I read a lot of little golden books. Often the same ones night after night. They have some favorites. The Tiny Scrawny Lion is a recent one that they really love. I do as well, but do a lot of reading that is very sort of kid-focused right now.
Those are actually probably really therapeutic. I used to love to read to my son when he was young, and he's now a writer, so it's interesting. Well, thank you all for joining us today. That brings us to our close. Hopefully, everyone listening in got some pointers. We will summarize some of the key points. We will post the recording of this session on our website. So if you were not able to join today, people will be able to listen. I want to especially thank all of our panelists for joining me today, and Josie for staying up late Friday night in UK. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, and you guys have a great weekend.
Thank you. Thanks.